What's going on, everyone? Welcome back. Today, we're going to be talking our top 10 wide receivers for the 2021 fantasy football season. We're going to be talking ranks, we're going to be talking tiers, and a full breakdown. Now, we did this a little bit earlier in the year, but there have been changes since then, so I wanted to give you a more updated breakdown of this, so make sure to tune in. And if you enjoy, hit that like button, subscribe, let us hear it in the comment section. Do you agree, disagree, along with any other questions you guys might have? I will do my best to answer them all. And lastly, make sure to check us out online at alldaypigskin.com. And while you're there, get yourself a copy of the 2021 ADP Fantasy Football Draft Guide. Everything you could want at a great value. Rankings like these and more. Details in the description. But with that being said, let's get into it. And you can see we have got our master list pulled up here with rankings, with tiers, with everything. Quick note, this is PPR based because there would be some differences if this was standard, which I will try to touch on while we go through this list. But with that in mind, let's kick it off. And we begin with DeVante Adams of the Green Bay Packers coming in at number 1. Now, no real big change here, as you can see at the top in terms of our tier 1 wide receivers. I continue to say, I personally have DeVante Adams as the number 1 guy, but if you want to make the argument, it should be Stephon Diggs or it should be Tyreek Hill, I completely support that. And I think for each one of these guys, you can make that argument. Each one has something going for them. It becomes kind of a personal preference kind of situation, but I think either way, all three of these guys are going to be the favorites to finish as the number 1 wide receiver in fantasy football. But speaking of DeVante Adams, now again with the Aaron Rodgers drama out of the way, he is going to be someone that you can rely on. And there was that brief period where his ADP had kind of gone down because people weren't sure what would happen with Rodgers. But now it's normalized again, and he's either the top or the second best wide receiver taken in drafts. And I would say if you can get him any later, then that's an absolute steal. His ADP, going to be middle to the end of the first round. But with DeVante Adams, what can I say? The guy was the number 1 wide receiver last season despite missing multiple games. That's how great and how big of a focal point he is for this offense. Now, yes, Randall Cobb has rejoined the Green Bay Packers, but Cobb at this point in time, I don't think he's really going to take away all that many opportunities from DeVante Adams. Adams is still going to be the go-to guy. More so than anything, Randall Cobb just kind of gives a somewhat other reliable target that he's familiar with in Randall Cobb. But I do think Cobb kind of, past his prime, even though being reunited with Aaron Rodgers should help. Not all that worried about it because there's been other times when Adams and Randall Cobb have overlapped in terms of their stay in Green Bay, and Adams was still the guy. This is a high-scoring offense. Aaron Rodgers is a proven quarterback, one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL, MVP last season, so not worried about DeVante Adams. High touchdown upside. Maybe you could argue that, look, his touchdowns might go down a little bit, but the fact that you're projecting a full season to be played from him, the receptions, the yards should kind of balance that out. And again, with a proven quarterback on a high-scoring offense with one of the favorite targets for Aaron Rodgers, and that's a big deal because that means guaranteed volume, DeVante Adams is a pretty safe bet, and he would be our guy in terms of the top overall wide receiver for 2021. But let's move on. Next, we've got Stephon Diggs. And this is, again, very, very close in terms of Stephon Diggs or Tyreek Hill, who you have at that number 2 spot. I went with Stephon Diggs because it is PPR based, and I do think he might get a little bit more volume. Again, if this was standard based, then I would have Tyreek Hill at the number 1 spot, then DeVante Adams at number 2, and Diggs probably at number 3, even though there's some other wide receivers here that I think could make an argument in terms of being ahead of Stephon Diggs, who I will touch on later in standard scoring. But as far as PPR is concerned, look, Stephon Diggs proved last season in his first year in Buffalo that he was the guy that Josh Allen would go to. They developed that chemistry very quickly. He was an absolute stud in terms of volume, in terms of receptions, thrived in that scoring format. And the main difference this season, I guess, look, no more John Brown. Now enter Emmanuel Sanders. Maybe Emmanuel Sanders can take away a little bit of volume away from Stephon Diggs, but I think Diggs is still the by far and away top weapon for Josh Allen, who, again, he took a big step forward last season. And that was a big reason why Stefon Diggs was able to break out the way that he did. I will say, Stefon Diggs probably a little bit riskier than Adams or Tyreek Hill, the riskiest one out of all these guys, simply because his quarterback hasn't done it consistently in terms of playing at an elite level for more than one season. That's not the case with Aaron Rodgers. That's not the case with Patrick Mahomes. But in terms of opportunities, in terms of who Stefon Diggs has to go up against, like, Tyreek Hill with a Travis Kelce opposite him, Diggs probably will have a few more opportunities, so that's why I'm not all that worried about it. I still think he belongs in that tier 1 list, but I do want to highlight the fact that, if there's any one of these wide receivers in terms of Adams, Diggs, or Tyreek Hill that potentially could have any slight risk associated with them, I'd say to some minimal percentage, it's probably Diggs, even though I am a big fan of Josh Allen, but I do want to point that out. Either way, though, I think Diggs is a very, very safe bet. And again, all these guys, if you can get them in the middle to the end of the first round, great. If they drop any further in the early second round, they are steals. And moving on to now our third wide receiver here in the tier 1 category, we have got Tyreek Hill, who I mentioned. If this is standard scoring, he would be my number 1 guy because at that point, receptions don't really matter. He has the biggest upside, I would say, in terms of big playability out of any wide receiver in the NFL. He is on an electric offense that doesn't bust all that offense with Patrick Mahomes running the ship. Now, it's kind of weird because Tyreek Hill, you could argue, he is the number 2 pass catcher on that team behind Travis Kelce. But either way, they both find a way to get it done and to be extremely fantasy relevant. That's what happens when you've got Patrick Mahomes under center and that Andy Reid offense that I feel like puts up at least on average 25, 30 points a game on the season. So Tyreek Hill has a very, very good opportunity here to duplicate the success he had last season. In fact, the great thing about Tyreek Hill last year is kind of for the first time, he put to bed those concerns about consistency issues because the years prior, there were a lot more gaps in terms of some huge weeks, like 40-plus point weeks from Tyreek Hill. And then he'd have 2-3 games where he kind of just puts up 10 points, something like that. That kind of disappeared last season, and that's a huge reason why we feel that, he definitely belongs in the tier 1 category. And consistency-wise, that he could be the number 1 guy. And now that his floor is a little bit higher, again, no problem if you draft him as the number 1 guy either. But let's move on from the top 3 guys. I feel like that's pretty chalk. Let's move into the tier 2 category. We begin here at number 4 with DeAndre Hopkins, who I would have ranked lower, again, if this was standard scoring, because I think that, yes, a big benefit for him is the fact that he's going to get peppered, absolutely peppered with targets. His reception count will probably be, maybe only behind Stefon Diggs, but yardage-wise and touchdown-wise, there could be room for improvement. You have got an A.J. Green joining. You've got a Rondell Moore. You've also got, Christian Kirk, maybe hopefully taking that next step forward. But also you've got kind of a rush-first quarterback. Not rush-first, but, 500 to 700 yards on the ground for Kyler Murray. So the point being is he isn't always looking to pass first like a Patrick Mahomes or a Aaron Rodgers. So, for that reason, we've got DeAndre Hopkins in this category here. But either way, he's going to be somebody that's very, very reliable in fantasy football. Might not have as many big blow-up games as some of these other guys, but I think he's got a relatively safe floor. So you're not really going to be let down from DeAndre Hopkins all that much. He's in an offense that, again, has a ton of weapons with a quarterback that also is in the tier 1 quarterback category respectively. So elite quarterback prospect with an elite wide receiver prospect that usually leads to a pretty good combination. See Patrick Mahomes, see Tyreek Hill, Josh Allen, Stefon Diggs. So we're not really all that worried about Hopkins. Again, the only downside I would say is maybe you won't get as many big blow-up games from Hopkins, but at the end of the day, in terms of PPR scoring, you won't be let down by him all that often either. But now let's move on to our number 5 guy here, and Calvin Ridley of the Atlanta Falcons, who he is the guy that I would have ranked the highest here. If this was standard scoring, he'd have the biggest difference in rank, because I'd be all right ranking Calvin Ridley right behind Tyreek Hill as like my number 2 guy in standard scoring. I think Calvin Ridley is going to be a huge beneficiary of the departure of Julio Jones. And, he's the unquestioned number 1 guy in Atlanta. Last year, he succeeded, whether it was just him, whether it was him with Julio Jones. Matt Ryan has, picked Calvin Ridley as his favorite target. He's had huge success in terms of touchdowns, kind of a big weapon there for the Atlanta Falcons. And now in PPR formats, I think that he's going to take another step forward. I don't think he'll necessarily get as many, targets as a Stephon Diggs or a DeVante Adams or a DeAndre Hopkins, but I don't think it will be that far behind. And if there's any tier 2 wide receiver here that I'm going to pick to make that jump into a tier 1 guy, it would be Calvin Ridley for me. I'm just trying to be a little bit more conservative because we still don't know how things will play out for this Atlanta offense without Julio Jones. What kind of role is Kyle Pitts going to have? Is Russell Gage going to be allowed to be the number 2 wide receiver? How will Matt Ryan fare, again, with one of his former top weapons in Julio Jones not being there? You've got a new head coach. So some question marks. But either way, I think Calvin Ridley is going to have a great season. And he's a guy that, if you can get at the end of the second round, which I have seen a lot of times, that is an absolute steal. And I am sprinting to crush that draft button at that point in time. I love the value for Calvin Ridley at the end of the second round. Moving along, though, we've got Justin Jefferson, who gave us a little bit of a scare earlier on in training camp in terms of kind of going down with what seemed to be a shoulder, but didn't really end up being anything too serious. So Justin Jefferson remains where he is ranked at that number 6 spot. Very high upside. We saw it last season as a rookie. Now, I think he's only going to get better, but at the same time, opposing defenses are going to be focusing in on him more so. The Vikings are a run-first team, so let's not forget that. That's kind of the first time we've mentioned that here in terms of the wide receivers we've brought up. That's not the case with the Falcons, with the Cardinals, with the Chiefs, with the Bills, or with the Packers. So I don't think there'll necessarily be that big of a focus on, airing it out every single week. And Kirk Cousins, compared to all these quarterbacks, I would say, kind of on the back burner in terms of elite, reliable quarterbacks, more so of a game manager. But either way, I think Justin Jefferson has cemented himself as like the alpha on this team. Even when Adam Thielen was healthy, Justin Jefferson was the guy in terms of targets, in terms of yards, in terms of receptions. The reason why, maybe that gap didn't seem so big between him and Adam Thielen is because of the touchdown success that Thielen had. But, if you factor in some touchdown regression, I think Justin Jefferson is going to be the big-time runaway winner in terms of the wide receiver one here for the Minnesota Vikings. I like the upside. I do think there will, we're getting to a point here where there's going to be some more up and down type of weeks as opposed to Hopkins and Ridley. But at the same time, we cannot start another tier, tier 3 guys. I think all of these guys here in this tier 2 list can be, a top 5 wide receiver. So they do belong in the conversation. But I do want to bring that up with Justin Jefferson nonetheless. Moving on, though, here we've got A.J. Brown at the number 7 spot. And Brown is a guy that's really interesting because, prior to Julio Jones being traded to the Tennessee Titans, I had seen A.J. Brown being somebody that was, projected to be maybe the number 1 wide receiver in fantasy football, a guy that was being drafted in the first round. And, I wouldn't say his value has taken a massive hit, but I've probably dropped him down 1 or 2 spots at most, though, because I still think that A.J. Brown is the main wide receiver on this team. And having somebody like a Julio Jones opposite him, to some extent, it does help take away coverage from A.J. Brown. But he's the younger guy. He's the guy that has better chemistry with Ryan Tannehill. He's healthier at this point, seemingly. And I think that A.J. Brown is the wide receiver 1 for the Tennessee Titans. I think he is more of a standard suited wide receiver for what it's worth. I don't see him getting, crazy volume because, again, the Tennessee Titans, similar to the Minnesota Vikings, again, we've got back-to-back teams that are run-first oriented with Derrick Henry there. That's the way they're set up. Ryan Tannehill, even though I do like him more as a quarterback than Kirk Cousins, if he doesn't have to be the guy that puts the team on his shoulders to win it all, he's going to very capably be that game-managing quarterback, which the Tennessee Titans have had a lot of success with him in that role. But to some extent, I can imagine the Titans maybe focusing a little bit more so on the pass now with Julio Jones being there, but I don't think it'll be to a level where they're now a pass-heavy team because, again, when you've got Derrick Henry, a guy that can get over 2,000 yards rushing on the ground, you don't go away from that. So A.J. Brown right now, end of the second round, I'm perfectly fine having him as my wide receiver 1. Feel very strongly about that. I like the upside. I like the touchdown upside. Probably have him a little bit higher in standard formats, but either way in PPR as well, a solid wide receiver 1. Moving on here, though, to Keenan Allen at number 8. My favorite wide receiver not named Calvin Ridley in this category. I think every single season Keenan Allen is slept on, and every single season you get him at a steal. And this season in 2021 is no exception because in 12-team leagues, Keenan Allen is falling to the third round. This is in PPR formats, which is his bread and butter. The guy gets volume like crazy. Sure, he might not have as high upside in terms of yardage and touchdowns, but the guy's going to get peppered with targets. We saw it last season. We saw it without Eckler. We saw it with Austin Eckler in the lineup. Justin Herbert loves Keenan Allen. Don't get me started on any of these other wide receivers for the LA Chargers. None of them are going to rival Keenan Allen for a majority of the targets. The second best pass catcher on this team is Austin Eckler. I love what Keenan Allen brings to the team. He is as safe of a wide receiver as you could want in PPR formats, even without touchdowns. The guy is good for 10 plus points every single week because he's probably going to catch like 7-8 passes per game and going to get you like 50 to 60 yards at a minimum. You throw in a touchdown to that is just gravy. I think he's the best value in the third round right now. I'd be perfectly fine in PPR formats if you draft him in the middle of the second round. That's how highly I think of him. And he's in a great offense with an up-and-coming quarterback with an improved offensive line, and that's going to make that entire offense better. So I'm a big fan of Keenan Allen. I absolutely think in PPR formats he can be a wide receiver 1. Obviously, in standard scoring, he probably wouldn't be in the tier 2 category, but since this is PPR-based, he definitely belongs in the wide receiver 1 conversation. Moving on to our second to last wide receiver here, we've got Allen Robinson of the Chicago Bears, and kudos, credit to Robinson. His quarterbacks so far in his career have been Blake Bortles and Mitch Trubisky, yet despite that, the guy pretty much puts back-to-back, like every single season, almost top 10 wide receiver performances up on the board. Now with the guy in Andy Dalton maybe for a little bit, then Justin Fields. We'll see when that transition takes place. I think Allen Robinson's in a good spot. I don't think by any accounts it'll be worse than when Mitch Trubisky was under center. Some people are going to argue if it's Justin Fields, he's a more composed quarterback. He can go through his reads. He won't focus in on just Allen Robinson, which there's a point to be made there. But I think you can also make the case then with a more accurate quarterback, throwing the ball to the best wide receiver on the team, bar none, that wide receiver is going to be in more positions to actually catch the football and actually make big-time plays and score touchdowns and have success offensively. So there's something to be said about that as well. Again, in PPR formats, I do like Robinson as a top 10 guy. I would have him ranked lower in standard scoring, similar to a Keenan Allen. He's more so of a volume guy. I don't see the huge touchdown or yardage upside with Allen Robinson. That's the only thing there. I think he's kind of like a light version of Keenan Allen, if that makes sense. But either way, Robinson is a guy that I think probably, again, a mid-level wide receiver 1. Probably not going to be in the tier 1 category as far as wide receivers are concerned, but either way, he's going to be somebody that has steady performances every single week. He's not going to be a guy that, you lose because of him. But finally, moving on to our number 10 guy on this list, we've got DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. And Metcalf had that huge breakout season last year. And now, a lot of people regard him as a bona fide wide receiver one, which I can't really disagree with. His ADP, usually end of the second round, early third round. But with DK Metcalf, there's just a couple things that concern me here, but again, not enough to take him outside of the tier 2 conversation. With DK Metcalf, I think he's going to be the number 2 wide receiver on his team behind Tyler Lockett in terms of receptions and in terms of volume. So that's something to point out. That was the case last season. Also, with the Seattle Seahawks, the tough thing there is, as great as they are, as great as Russell Wilson is, I love Russell Wilson. I think he's an extraordinary quarterback. The Seahawks, you look at the last 5 years, I almost feel like they just go through these stretches. For the first 4 or 5 weeks, they look like the best team in the NFL. Russell Wilson is the runaway MVP. He's putting up yards like nobody else. And then they just kind of go on a cold streak. They kind of try and change things up because, whether it's system-wise, whether it's the head coach wanting to keep, Russell Wilson fresh for a playoff run, something like that, they turn their attention back to the rushing game. They kind of dial it down for Russell Wilson. And I'm afraid of those inconsistencies for this team. And DK Metcalf isn't the only weapon for the Seattle Seahawks. Like I said before, you've got Tyler Lockett, you've got Chris Carson. Russell Wilson can get it done with his legs as well. And when they go on those cold streaks, that's when I worry about this offense. DK Metcalf, somebody that I would have higher in standard scoring formats because I don't think he's going to get you that big reception number. Sure, he's got, a good touchdown upside, but if you take that away, I get a little bit concerned. I think he's somebody similar to an A.J. Brown in that type of way in terms of the type of wide receiver you're going to get. But I do think Brown probably gets a little bit more volume at the end of the day, especially if, Julio Jones gets banged up, something like that. Just right now, in a spot where A.J. Brown, I feel like, is a little bit safer. The Titans a little bit more consistent. But at the end of the day, again, DK Metcalf can absolutely be a wide receiver one. The upside is definitely there, but I did want to highlight some of those risks. As opposed to Keenan Allen and Allen Robinson, there could be weeks where you lose because of DK Metcalf, where he puts up 10 points or less than 10 points. So keep that in mind, but you could almost make the case for anybody on the Seattle Seahawks offense. So it just pays to know the situation on a team-per-team basis. But with that being said, we kind of wrap this thing up here with DK Metcalf. And again, if you enjoyed this breakdown of our top 10 wide receivers for the 2021 fantasy football season, let us hear it in the comments section. Agree, disagree, along with any other questions. Again, if you enjoyed, hit that like button, subscribe. Keep a lookout for the continued version of this video, top 20 wide receiver breakdowns. It'll get very interesting there as well. And lastly, check us out online at alldaypigskin.com. And while you're there, get yourself a copy of the 2021 ADP Fantasy Football Draft Guide. All the details in the description. But in the meantime, we'll see you guys in future videos.